And I can share my screen, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think so. Let me know if you don't have the ability.
It looks like I can. Great. So I'm going to start sharing. And then I always keynote on this sort of thing always kind of throws me off. So can you see Fathom information design?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. The Zoom controls are, of course, like right in the middle of the presentation, so it's like really annoying. So let me just.
Yeah, they need to rethink that interface design.
Yeah. So here we go. Yeah. All right. So yeah, Fathom information design, yeah, excited to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our process first, how we approach things, how we do a lot of the things that you just described, how we kind of get the data and work through it, and in the context of some specific work that we've done over the years. And but before doing that, kind of want to talk about the considerations that we bring to a project. Three key things that we bring to every project are, what is the data? What can it say? What can it not say, right? Sometimes you'll get, we work with clients who want to get a particular message out of the data, and that's not always possible, right? Sometimes the data just doesn't say what they want it to say. So there's always an examination of the data and what's there. Another key consideration is audience. Are you building this for experts? Are you building it for lay people? And that will inform the text you use to describe things, the way you present it, how much detail, and how much explaining, what you end up showing, the messages that you try to show, and also the context. If you're working on a piece that is sort of an exploratory thing for an analyst, you can assume that you can usually assume that you're going to have a desktop situation or a laptop at least. With a larger screen, it might be running on a server with all sorts of computational power to do all sorts of in-depth queries. If you're doing something where you're communicating some data findings, that might be a mobile device, and that presentation is going to be very different. If you've got a limited amount of screen space and you're trying to engage people when they're on the go somewhere, you're going to design. You want to design your information and the interactions for that context very differently from the analyst context. So these are three key considerations we bring to every project, and we'll give demonstrations of different versions of that as in a few moments. And much like you said, the process you were using to describe how you build visualizations, that's something that we do as well. And there are many different disciplines that data visualization draws upon. There's the computer science aspect of like parsing the data and acquiring the data, using statistics and math to figure out what can be told or can't be told about it. Graphic design and figuring out what's a good representation for the data that you're trying to present. And then human-computer interaction, user interface design, for how you're going to interact with it. And you can think of your project as just this one line, but we find that it's more useful to apply more of a design iteration approach. Sometimes you get halfway and you're looking at representation and you say, it would look better if I filtered out this data, or if I added some new data in there. And so you kind of go back a few steps and move up from there. Or once you start interacting, you realize, oh, I could show a summary here, or I could show more detail here. And those interactions can inform the way that you want to shape the data for the piece. So that iteration is critical to getting a really good final product. And it's something we do frequently. Just a quick word about Fathom. We've also got Kyle Oba. He's one of the developers from Fathom. I'm also more on the development side. Fathom has basically a range of developers and designers and people in between, and all working together through this sort of process to try and develop the pieces that we're going to be showing. So the first piece I want to show, oh, and one other thing. I'm happy if you ask questions. I think it might be better to save questions for the end of the talk if you can, but if there's a piece that you have some questions specifically about, if you could at least wait until I'm done with the slides for that particular piece, because the flow I have worked out for this presentation is sort of fragile in my head and it could easily get thrown off. So if that's okay with you, that's how I prefer to handle questions. So to jump right in, the first piece I'm going to talk about is something we did a few years ago for National Geographic. And it's a good piece to describe the story finding aspect of what we do, as well as some of the design iterations for what's the best way to represent the data. And the National Geographic contacted us to do something for a series they were doing on the future of food. And they wanted us to do something about global diet. And we took that and wanted to build something about environmental impact of diet worldwide. And we did a bunch of independent research, and we found some fairly robust data for the United States, but we couldn't find robust data for all the countries in the world. At which point the National Geographic team hooked us up with the Food and Agriculture Organization from the United Nations. There's a group of economists and statisticians who've been collecting all sorts of agricultural data for like 50, 60 years in all these different dimensions, the production, the yields, the prices, exports, consumption, blah, blah, blah. There's a ton of data. So what we frequently do in a case like this is we will grab it all and then build a tool to explore it. So like I mentioned before, we have developers in the office, and this is the sort of thing that we will frequently do. We'll try to build a tool so that we can share the exploration of the data among the entire office, including those who aren't as design or analysis savvy. And it's a kind of first pass at figuring out what we can and can't visualize. So what this tool is doing, there's a column on the left that chooses the broad category and another column that kind of chooses a subcategory. Once you choose that, there's a timeline that shows up for every country for which they have data. And some of them are grayed out because there's no data for that country. And if you look at the timelines, like right now, they're very flat. So that's showing us there's not a lot of variation for that particular data point. So it's probably not going to be a very interesting story. And some of them, you can see that are kind of broken. They only have data for part of the time series. So that kind of is a way to explore and figure out which data sets are going to be robust enough to tell a good story. So as I said, we're trying to link diet to environmental impact. And this is the only real environmental impact data we can find in the data set. It's CO2 emissions from meat and crop production per capita. And the story it tells is it's not very granular, it's not very fine, it's pretty rough. What it basically says is that all the CO2 emissions that come from agriculture are basically meat. There's some other stuff, but it's mostly meat. And that's what we suspected, but it's not really giving us the sort of detail that we're after. Also, you can see like on the left, the Falkland Islands, that's a country with a small population. So our hunch is that there's some kind of crazy rounding error that just makes that their emissions just essentially off the chart. So looking at this, it's not something that we could do to support the story we were after. So then it was a matter of exploring, going back to the data and figuring out what we could tell. We ended up with using the food balance worksheets. And this is an example of one of those. This is one country for 1 year, and we've got nearly 200 countries, 55 years of data. And on this kind of spreadsheet, each row is one food type. And it could be corn, it could be beans, or it could be a summary of seafoods. And every column is a different metric. There's like tons exported, or daily calories consumed per capita, all sorts of things. And it's pretty rich. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So this was what we decided to work with. And the task then becomes, how do we translate this economist statistician data into something that is useful for the National Geographic audience? So National Geographic audience tends to be fairly educated, but not by any means experts in international agricultural economics or anything like that. So what translations do we need to do to be able to tell this story to lay people, right? So one of the things we have to do is some translation of the jargon, basically taking the terms that the statisticians use in those spreadsheets and converting it into something that's more like what you see at the grocery store. And I just kind of want to emphasize for a moment the importance of writing and good writing for information design. like people would be able to figure out if we put bovine cattle, like they'll be able to figure out for themselves, like, okay, this is beef steaks, you know, etc. But that moment of having to figure it out is like that's cognitive load that they're not putting towards understanding the message that you're trying to tell them. So simplifying that just allows a much smoother consumption of the story that you're trying to tell. So it's worth really refining those terms and that terminology to make it communicate cleanly and quickly. After that, the next kind of granularity we wanted to look at in the data was geographic. The data that we got has all sorts of regional data, and so this is an example of some of that. And some of the regions are like Western Europe, Oceania, Middle Africa. So, and looking at the charts, you can see there's enough variation that there's probably a good story there. And what we're looking at are trends of meat consumption. Each different colored red band is a different type of meat. And we wanted to emphasize meat for this piece because meat production has a huge impact on emissions, right? But instead of the regional, we thought that looking at the country level was more interesting. So this is a chart of meat consumption for every country in the data set. And you can see there's a lot of variation here. And not only is there a lot of variation and good data, when you look at things at the country level, you can hook into things that people may know about these different countries and different cultures that helps them relate to the story that you're trying to convey. So for instance, with China, you can see the impact of opening up the economic policies in the 80s and the meat consumption. Just as people get wealthier, they consume more meat. With Cuba, you can see Cuba was really dependent on the Soviet Union for their economy. And when the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 90s, the economy contracted, so did the meat consumption. You can see the impact of the first Gulf War in Kuwait. And also culturally, much of the population in India is vegetarian. And so there's not as much meat consumption. It's a fairly flat curve for them. And so these are all hooks that people say, oh yeah, that's something I know, that helps them get familiar with the things they may already know about your data set, and then help you show more things, that they're new things to them that they might not know already. So this is where we landed with the meat consumption representation, but that wasn't the only story we wanted to tell. We also wanted to tell a story about kind of the balance of diets worldwide. And so, this is a sample of what that balance looks like as a bar chart for every country, nearly 200 countries. And, each color bar represents a different food type. And visually, the thing that jumps out at your eye first pass is that each country has this tall, dark gray bar on the left, and you can look it up, and that's the grains and starch consumption for every country. And so if the story that you're trying to tell is that most countries, the calories per capita per day come from grains and starch, then this is your representation. This really shows that. That isn't really what we wanted to tell. We didn't want to just point at that main food source. We wanted to talk more about balance. So we started iterating through different representations, and we've got a really nice big poster-sized printer in the office. So we printed up these posters, to kind of explore the data. This is another take on the same data set, where the height of each rectangle represents the total calories per day, and then the width of the rectangle within each country's chart represents the balance of food. And so this, they're sorted by calorie consumption, but you can definitely see that trend, and it's fairly obvious that, once you know that Belgium is consuming way more calories than Somalia. But it kind of looks like little flags, and it's not great. It works, but it's, let's keep on pushing. Try it as a pie chart, and circular things, like, seems like a lot of people are predisposed to like them. So this was a different color scheme, but essentially the same data. Where we landed on it was with these rings. Partially, I think they're a little bit easier to read to my eye, but also there's a natural intuition that a thicker ring has more calories than a thinner ring, and that is a very obvious analogy or visual analogy that we can use that helps communicate what the data is all about. So with that in mind, here's what we ended up doing for the final piece. And yeah, you can see that there's one, we're focusing on the world at the opening, and you can hover over and look at details for each of the different food groups. And off to the right, we've got a lot of little, other charts for individual countries that are responding to the mouse interactions that you're doing on that main one. So you can make those comparisons from country to country really easily. And also spent a lot of care with the animations as things move around. You can select different countries. You can also play back the timeline or scrub through the timeline to see how the diet's changed over time. And then another thing I want to draw your attention to is that paragraph that's on the left. Each country for each, in the meat view or the balanced diet view, has that paragraph that helps explain what people will be able to find in the data and why we thought that country was interesting. We didn't show every country. We just showed roughly 20 of them to highlight different aspects of the data and how it plays out across the world. And a lot of effort went into the visual refinement and the animations. And this is the case where the animations are really useful. They help kind of, as things animate from one thing to another, it helps maintain the context. For instance, as we click around, I'm going to scroll back on this movie just a little bit so we can see it. The y-axis moves as you click different countries, and as that shifts, it's useful to see that moves and doesn't just click into place, because it also helps you. We wanted to rescale the chart for every country so that you could read it easily. So some aren't too flat and some aren't too big. So we want to make sure that people realize, though, that those different countries are happening at different scales, and that there's a dramatic change there. And the animation helps you see that change and register that, okay, we're looking at a different scale when we switch from this country to this country. So it's a really fun piece to work on, and a lot of iteration, a lot of data exploration, and it worked out pretty well for National Geographic. It was one of the first times they did a data kind of visualization instead of a text or photojournalism based article, and it did surprisingly well. So we were really pleased with the result of that. Next piece that I'd like to show is something we did for a very different type of audience. National Geographic was explaining the food data to lay people. This was a piece that was commissioned by a systems biology lab at Stanford. And the work that they do is essentially trying to model all the processes that happen in a cell. And this is, they're building off the work that's been going on for decades, where a biologist will publish a paper where they're able to model a particular process, like how this specific protein interacts and contributes to cell reproduction via, the processing of this particular molecule. And so what this team did is they went through all these hundreds of papers and extracted all these formulas about, given this input, here's how this one little part of the cell responds to it, and here's what it outputs, and linked them all together into one huge model of how a cell works. And they've got a fairly complete model of how E. coli works, for instance. And there are tens of thousands of different nodes and hundreds of thousands of links between them of how these processes interact. So it's an extremely complex model. And they'll run it for essentially the generation of a cell reproducing. And it outputs reams of data. They have this one story that the head of the lab was going to a conference, and he wanted to include their latest results. And so they had to FedEx him this thick binder. And he was on the call, like trying to go through the results. He was calling the lab and just flipping through the binder and kind of looking through these text printouts. It was just huge, and obviously not a very quick or efficient way of working with the data. So we built them a tool that allows them to quickly, find a starting point with a node in the cell, and then find other nodes that are connected to it. And each one of those nodes has a timeline of its, what it's up to during the cell reproduction cycle. And by building out this graph of nodes, they can also choose like to build up these pathways, like what's happening in the column on the left. And they select a node and they put it in there. And then by looking at all the different time series, they're able to find similar patterns or corresponding similar behavior between these nodes. And in so doing, they're hoping to discover sort of causal connections in the cell that aren't yet understood, because there has been, as shown earlier, there are hundreds of papers written about the processes of the cell, but there's obviously much yet to learn. And so this tool is helping speed the discovery of those different areas of exploration that they're working on. So that was a really interesting and in-depth project. But again, for an audience that's very expert, knows a lot, we in this piece, we brought a lot of our intuition about, hey, we should show this, or like this is getting way too dense. We probably ought to cut back on what we're showing, and these analysts were like, no, we need all that data in order to make the sorts of decisions that make this a useful tool. So a very different audience, very different requirements, and really, really interesting project. I understand that one of the things you might be working on this semester is a project where you collect some personal data and might have to visualize that, work with that. So I thought it might be interesting to show some of the work that we did with activity tracking back in the day. Back in like 2013, 2014, Nike had the Fuel Band, which was one of the first wrist-based activity trackers. So sort of like Fitbit, but it was cooler because it was Nike. And this graph is the sort of thing that you would see if you ever logged in. If you're using the Fitbit and tracking your data, you might log in and see this. This isn't something Fathom did. This is what Nike had. And the idea that they had was, basically you can see a full day, midnight to midnight, and the y-axis corresponds to how active you are at any given hour. And if you don't have much activity, you're in the red, but once you're active enough, it turns green. And they did pretty well with the Fuel Band. Eventually, they got out of the hardware business and stopped altogether. But while they did it, they had a few million people that were using it, and they commissioned Fathom to start looking at sort of summary analysis. And one of the things they really wanted to see was the average of take all the Fuel Band users in the world and like average their data together. And what do you get? And you get something that's sort of lumpy. We had a couple of different slices of the data, but at the end of it, we shifted it from midnight to 4 a.m. because that's sort of a more natural break in people's activity. But essentially, the finding that you have from this shape is that people wake up, they go to lunch, and then they kind of do something in the evening, and they go to sleep. And yeah, everyone does that, but that's not the story, right? There's nothing particularly interesting about that. Once you aggregate everyone's data into an average, you've lost all the detail that makes it really interesting to look at individual people. So we decided that we wanted to do something where we could look at individual people. And so without asking Nike, we started working on this project that we then pitched back to them, and they really liked it. The first iteration of it was this tongue-in-cheek take on Ben, the founder of the firm, went to this Nike event. And so, you can see him, he's tucked back in that photograph up there, he's tucked back there. And we've called out his activity on that day and sort of wrote a bunch of fictitious things that he was probably doing during the time, like getting a free lunch, et cetera, et cetera. But underneath that timeline is the aggregation of all his other days of activity. So kind of reflected downwards. And it's not a great representation, but you can definitely see like, okay, that's when he's sleeping and that he's, busy in the morning and busy in the evening. And there's sort of a lull, in the 2 to 3 range for him in most days. So we took this and started playing with it and got someone else's data. This is someone who's more active, has more of a pattern. It's a physical trainer who was a friend of someone in the office. And, the first pass was just putting all the data in here and again, doing that 4 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift. And just overlaying all the days on top of each other and calling out the day of their most energy. So that's the dark gray, black line that you can see there. Um, then, taking out the scratchy lines and let's do opacity instead. What does that give us? And we can see some useful clumping and things start to hang together nicely. And then we start folding in some color and experimenting with palette. And in this version, the blue is it's kind of a blue is cool, not a lot of energy. Red is hot, more energy. And it gets a little bit muddled. It's sort of hard to read. So we were going to reiterate a lot on the palette. We end up at something more fire oriented where it's, yellows and oranges are less energy going through to red and then up to blue and purple for the really high intensity. So that palette is reflected in these charts. We've got two charts here because they're reflecting our investigation of how much time, how big a segment of time, how much granularity do we want there. So on the left is 1 minute data, and on the right is 5 minute, the activity aggregated into 5 minutes. And the 1 minute data is really spiky. It's actually too much detail. It's hard to pick out trends. It's just kind of messy. It improves a little bit with the five minute data. And then with 15-minute data and 30-minute data, it's the 15 minutes is pretty good. 30 is starting to get a little too wide, but it gets even wider with 1 hour and 2 hour data. By the time you get to 2 hour data, you've lost a lot of the detail for the individual days. And again, I don't know if I said, like, this is essentially this one person's, like, all the days that they've been active with the fuel band. So this person has logged, I think, a few hundred days of activity. And so that's each of those time series just overlaid here. And this is where we ended up. This is a different person. This is James, who was a designer in the office at the time. And I think we ended up going with 10-minute data here. And it might be 5 minutes. I actually don't remember, I'm sorry. But you can see the pattern of his activity. And you can see that there's, he's busy in the morning. There's something happening in the middle of the day and something definitely more activity in the evening. But, either side of lunchtime, he's not doing a lot. And I worked right next to James for a few years. Like, that is exactly what he did. He would ride his bike to work. He would sit down. He would go for a walk at lunchtime. And he would sit down for the afternoon and they'd bike home. So this very much reflects his activity. Across the bottom are a few other summary statistics that show, how much time you spend in different levels of activity, what days of the week are you most active, and when you're getting the most exercise. This is James at this point in his life had 2 young children. So his weekends, he was more active than he was during the week, but he wasn't actually getting any focused exercise because he's just constantly moving, kind of chasing them around. And how many workouts do you get per week, etc. And so this was a great view into his personal data, but it gets really fun when you compare lots of people's data together. So this is a sample of a few Nike employees and some of the Fathom employees. At the top left, you've got a Nike employee who goes on a pretty hefty run every morning. So that's those blue tall peaks. And they're fairly active, lots of red in there for all the other days. Right next to them, the second from the left in the top row, you've got somebody who alternates between low energy yellow days and like high energy blue days. Next to them, you've got Ben from the office. So again, no particular pattern to his activity, but he's always fairly active. Right beneath him, so third from the left in the middle row, you've got another Nike employee who runs marathons and wins them. She's a super intense person, so everything's super saturated, super high reds and blues. And right beneath that, the bottom row, third from the left, that's me. And there's one day that stands out, and that's the day that I lent my fuel band to my partner, who went on a run and just blew everything away and made me feel really, really lazy. So I started exercising after that. So we did these, and then we did them for basically everyone in every fuel band user that had over 30 days of activity. And that, and just put it out there for everyone to download and compare. And so you can see, people were able to tweet their images, and so you can see the variety that people had. And there's kind of this nice sort of data selfie thing that people could share around. So it was a really fun project. that one went pretty well. So Nike said, well, let's do another thing with the fuel data, and wanted to look at the impact of activity. I'm sorry, the impact of weather on activity. So when you sign up for the fuel band, you have to provide your zip code, and with that, we were able to find find out what state people live in, and then also find the nearest weather station. And with that, then we could create a baseline of what's the average activity for any given state, and then when the weather changes, how does activity change with it? So, for instance, when the weather is in the 50 to 60 degree range, this chart is showing, that people in Wyoming are 6% more active, or I'm sorry, people registered in Wyoming, they might not be in Wyoming, but registered in Wyoming will be 6% more active on days that are in 50 to 60 degree range for people, fuel band users who are registered in Wyoming. Obviously, it's a really specific population, and it's nothing to publish a science paper over, but it was, for this purpose, it was good enough. So Wyoming users in 50 degree range, more active. People in Arizona, all the way on the right, they're less active, by about 4%. And we put this all onto a map and then encoded the changes in activity in both color and height of every state to make it kind of more engaging. Rolled that out on this website. And so you can see this is in 67 degree range. Only Florida is lower than normal activity, because I guess in Florida that's cold. Everywhere else, people are above the average. You can zoom in, you can look at the specific numbers for each individual state, see which states do the best and worst in that temperature range, and then go to a different temperature as well. As it gets warmer, you kind of see Vermont drops off. Minnesota is not happy with these hot temperatures, but southern states tend to get more active. As it gets colder, the southern states really start to say the activity drops pretty severely, pretty quickly. Minnesota and Vermont now are actually saying, well, we're still keeping busy. So it's a fun piece to do for them, and not quite as impactful as the year in Nike Fuel, but still a really interesting piece, and a really challenging one to work through. And then based on that, we did our own little experiment using the Android watch. Rather than kind of measure your activity, could we build something that's just a sort of fun experience to indicate to you, like, hey, this is how active you're being, and kind of reward people getting up and moving around by having this fun watch face. We did several of these to help, just as a fun experiment. So those projects that I've talked about so far are all, fairly quantitative, looking at time series, looking at pie charts, etc. We also, over the past few years, have done a lot of work with large document sets and groups of text and articles. And the most recent of those efforts was released this past year back in 2019 in a piece called Laniakea. And in this, what we do is we took articles in Wikipedia, like a subset, like nearly 40,000 articles in Wikipedia, the most commonly downloaded ones, and basically laid them out here with a pretty simple algorithm. Each dot that's on the screen represents one of those Wikipedia articles. And it's a simple rule. If two articles are similar, they're going to be placed close to one another. And it's a very simple rule, but iterated through nearly 40,000 documents, you get this really complicated sort of galaxy sort of layout. And here, as the mouse is moving over, you can see these are all similar things. Like right now, we're looking at 20th century musical composers. We're looking at Olympics a few minutes ago. These are TV series, stuff like that. And in addition to the layout, we ran some modeling on there to kind of create what are 9 topics that kind of embody most of what these articles are all about, and then assign each document to one of those articles. And so those are the things around the perimeter there, the kind of colored areas that have the numbers. So at the top, there's war, king, army, and there's a purple dot. So all the purple documents kind of fall into that general area. You know? And what makes this more fun is, so you can see, you know, as you mouse over those terms and those topics, you can see which documents, you know, they light up to show which articles are linked to that. And then you can also drill down, and so you can actually select all the documents that are in that topic, and it reruns the modeling for those. So you can say, okay, if I'm drilling down into, you know, computers, what is the space of all the documents that have to do with computers? What does that look like? You know, oh, I can find one on data visualization, and I can go read it and come back to the app, etc. So it's a way of not just kind of getting an overview, but also drilling down and seeing, okay, how do these categories and subcategories, how do they organize? What's the landscape of knowledge that's embedded in Wikipedia? What does that look like? And it's a technique that we ran not just for Wikipedia, but also can be run with other document sets. So this is the layout for PubMed, which is a set of nearly 100,000, or I think it is about 100,000 biology and medical journal articles. And you know, these topics, I'm not really a practicing biologist or doctor, so, but you know, showing these to people who are more familiar with PubMed, they're like, okay, yeah, that's what they would expect to see. So it's a kind of fun exploration for those large document sets. But as opposed to you know, many documents, a related area is our kind of office's fascination with typography. You know, there are lots of there's a lot of typography discussions going on in the office. And this next project is kind of this weird thing where basically Ben had this fascination with PDFs and wanted to kind of find a way to kind of exploit that interest, but to a non-technical audience to some extent. And the deal is that if you've got a PDF, you know, a portable document format, you know, we can look at this and we can see it and read it, etc. What you might not know is that the fonts that are used for the PDF are actually they're embedded in the document. So there will be a copy of these fonts. But the font only has the characters that they need. So, you know, there are like 5 or 6 fonts going on here, right? When you look at the International Technology, the 2003 edition, et cetera, and you go down to the very bottom of the page, and in that lower right corner, right, there's the italics right there. They would have that font, but only the characters for 2, 0, and 3. And it's embedded in the PDF. Like if this page were the PDF, that's all the characters they would have. And, you know, there are, you know, millions of PDFs out all over the world. And each one of them just has these little subsets of the fonts in them. And so you'll get these really kind of, you know, strange subsets of the alphabet with each one. And, you know, you can get, you know, a PDF that looks like this, and, you know, the font that's in the middle next to product description, you're going to have a fairly robust number of characters. But you can also, you know, you get fonts, you know, for something like this, and you're going to get this crazy mishmash of characters and glyphs. And, you know, you'll get all these strange subsets of the alphabet. And, you know, that just those broken up fonts are something that kind of fascinated Ben. And the nickname for these things was, you know, they're these little Franken fonts. They're these kind of little monsters that are put together for the PDFs. But we're trying to figure out how do you use that? What's a good way of kind of conveying that? And then obviously, okay, Franken font, well, you print a copy of Frankenstein using all these fonts. And so what we did is we identified each of the, you know, all the unique words in the books. There are, I think, 5,800 or so. And for each one of those words, we did a Google search to find PDFs. And from those top 10 or 15 PDFs, we would scrape the fonts off the little font subsets and ended up with this huge collection of glyphs. So this is I forget how big this poster is. I think it might be about 8 feet tall. Zooming into, just a few, the center part, you've got the H's, the I's through the M's, you've got those rows. And you can see, most of it is recognizable letters, but you're getting some kind of strange, there's a hand, there's a delta, there's rectangles and other glyphs that kind of pop up. And what we did was kind of identify the individual fonts. I think when they're stored in the PDF, they're stored with a name. So we found for every weird set of glyphs, every font that showed up in the PDF, we would tally how often those glyphs showed up and under what font, and identified the more common ones to the ones that show up very rarely. And then printed up Frankenstein with the start of the book being the fonts that show up more commonly. So here's the first page. So there's lots of Arial, there's lots of Times Roman, etc. And then as the book progresses, showing more of those kind of strange one-off fonts. So you're seeing a lot more bolds and italics show up here, but nothing too radical. But by the end of the book, you're seeing these fonts that just show up every once in a while, these rarities. And it's kind of fun to just, well, for me, I like in the way that a typeface kind of embodies a voice. If you read this, like in your inner mind, like the voice that, when I read this, like the voice that's in my head is just this strange, kind of thing that's constantly changing and feels really broken up and weird. So it's I haven't actually tried to read the whole book in this setting, but it is a kind of interesting mental exercise. So yeah, so just some basic numbers. There were, we downloaded nearly 65,000 PDFs, getting over 55,000 unique glyph shapes, and almost 342,000 characters in the book. We put it all together and we submitted it to be published, and got this response that basically said, we think your PDF's broken because the fonts, they get really weird at the end of the book. And we persevered, we worked through the issue with them, and we did print it. It is available for sale on our website. So, and if anyone's interested in that, I can help you find the right link. But yeah, that was a passion project of Ben's that was really fun to get going. Back in the land of text, we have this other piece we did a few years ago for On Being. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the On Being podcast, but what their goal is kind of to be opposite the news cycle, which is very sensationalist, like, oh my God, this is what's happening today, this is what's happening today, etc. And they try to say, okay, the world is changing and it's changing fast, and we live in tumultuous times, and yet there's stuff that's constant, and what expertise can we bring to help understand the world? And the format is that the host, Krista Tippett, will have a conversation with some luminary, either from the arts or sciences or social justice or spirituality, and they just have this this long conversation that they usually edit down to about an hour. And they've been doing this for, at the time we did this project, they've been doing it for 14 years, roughly 30 episodes a year, building up an archive of basically 2.7 million words, nearly 400 episodes. And they wanted to tap into that history of of these conversations. Can they make use of this archive? Because if you're looking for persisting wisdom, then even though it's a conversation that may be 10 or 15 years old, there's something said that could help understand what we're going through now, right? And so, they built up a pretty big archive, and so they hired us to say, can you help us, make use of this archive? And so we tried to run some text analysis to figure out, when On Being is talking about something, what are they talking about? What separates it from, what makes it different from all the other stuff that's going on in the world? So we compared term frequency in On Being to the Google corpus, which is basically Google's version of everything ever written, right? And found what words come out more frequently. So a lot of these are names, so not necessarily as useful, because that's obviously can be fairly specific. But in another format, once you start grouping different flavors of different terms, like, for instance, highlighted here, you've got bioethical, bioethicist, et cetera, various variations on bioethics. Once you group all those together, you can start to see a little bit more variation in, okay, what does On Being talk about as opposed to what does everybody else talk about? And we were running through this and kind of characterizing what is the On Being archive really about when we were talking with our contact in On Being, and they kind of gave us a new direction. They basically said, yeah, it's not about exposing the archive so much as like getting people to listen to a few episodes and really get hooked and get into it. And so that's a very different thing. It's not about presenting an overview of what is On Being all about. It's like, it's more about, hey, I've got someone who's coming to this website. How can I give them an episode that speaks to them? And then once they've found that, find some more things that are like that. And so that's a very different challenge. And so part of that was exploring similarity, much like we did with the Laniakea and the similar Wikipedia articles. We're trying to find episodes of On Being that are similar. And so this is one of those tools we built to explore the data. And in it, every dot is an episode of On Being, and you choose one dot and it comes to the center. And two things happen when it comes to the center. All the terms that are in that episode show up in the columns on the left with the little bar charts to show how distinctive each word is for that particular episode. And two, all the other episodes move either towards the center if they're similar to that episode, or farther away to the perimeter if they're dissimilar. And so it gives you a feel that some of the episodes have a lot of episodes similar to them, others don't. And it's a basic kind of way of exploring this whole set of idea of similarity across episodes. But as a representation, it's kind of flying dots. You know, it's like it has been done, and it's not really specific to On Being. It's a great exploratory tool for us, but if you're trying to build something that is speaks to the On Being audience, like this doesn't say anything really that's On Being more than says something about any other topic matter. So we were struggling to find a representation that really spoke to what On Being is all about. And so as part of the text analysis, what we did is we found the most distinctive phrase in every episode. And we took those and we stacked them one on top of each other. So in this poster, every line represents a different episode, and the two terms that are in the center of the line that are darkest are the terms that are most specific to that episode and the kind of most defining phrase. And the thing that's kind of fun about this is that if you read those little phrases after, sort of like this imbalanced haiku or kind of free poetry that begins to kind of target what On Being is all about, like quantum mechanics, traumatic stress, well together, storytelling poet, coral reef, true love, abortion issue, unearned suffering, white debt. You know, these are all things that On Being definitely talks about, and it starts to get at the character of the different episodes for On Being. So this was the launch point for what we ended up doing. And it's, you know, what in the long run, what we did is not a data visualization per se. It's information design, because we're finding, you know, we're helping people navigate On Being, but it's not, we're not visualizing data in the strict sense of the word. And so the experience is you land here and you can see, you know, you land on an episode and its most prominent phrase is across the top, and then lined up under the bottom, at the bottom are other similar episodes that might be interesting to explore. If you land on one that isn't really your thing, you can click on one of these categories at the top to choose another episode from those ideas. And if you find an episode that you like, you can start reading that. And as you scroll through, you can read the entire episode here, but on the left, we indicate other episodes that might be of interest. Like if what's on the screen right now is your thing, then hey, maybe you want to read this other article or episode as well. So really helping people find that one episode that's going to speak to them, and then finding other episodes like that. And then there's also, like here, we're looking at sort of a search functionality that is closer to sort of data visualization that you might see in other places. Because sometimes you kind of know what you want and you want to look for it. But the idea is really much more about, hey, let me see some of this text. Let me see what On Being is really all about. And So now this next project is what we've been up to in 2020, really. Ironically, we started off the year working with this lab at Harvard, the Schifferli lab, on something about pandemics and education around pandemics. Party Schifferli is this really brilliant biologist at Harvard and MIT. And she was looking at Lassa fever in West Africa back in 2014, 2015. And when they started seeing some of the samples come back and it wasn't Lassa fever, it was Ebola. And so they were right there from the beginning of the Ebola outbreak at that time. And she got to see firsthand, a lot of the public health implications of the work they were doing and how the testing works and how how all the organizations work together or don't in response to a pandemic. And ever since then, she's been really on fire about trying to educate people in this country about pandemics and educate people about pandemic readiness. So back in 2018, her lab developed this fun program for middle schoolers where you could essentially simulate the pandemic. And what everyone gets a phone, and there's a special app that basically shows how healthy you are. And so the person right there in front holding the sick phone, with the orange background and the sad face and the thermometer, that's one of the lead developers on the project with the Schifferli lab. And using Bluetooth, that sickness may spread to all those other phones that are near him, and they can, using, fairly sophisticated modeling, like the images are really playful and fun and great for middle schoolers, but using some really top-notch statistical modeling to figure out how does the disease spread from phone to phone. And, very realistically, you can wear masks and personal protective equipment, and you might get vaccinated and you might get sick and you might be asymptomatic and you might recover and you might not. It's a great educational thing for these events for middle schoolers. They get really into it. And there are teams that work on diagnostics and epidemiologists, and they have the politicians who are allocating the vaccines, and you see every true aspect of human behavior. I think in one of the events, like the president of the simulation was hoarding vaccines for his personal staff. So all the good and the bad happens in these events, and so they're really great educational things. The problem that they had was that in order to prepare for it, they had to do like a day or two's worth of statistical modeling to figure out the parameters that would go on the phones for the game. And they wanted to, the program was taking off. They wanted to do it for more schools. So they were trying to figure out, is there a way to let people set up their own parameters? So that's what we were working on with them. And we set up this thing where you can tweak all the knobs on the left and run the simulation, and the simulation plays out in the browser where, the red little X's are people who might be asymptomatic but are spreading the disease. And, they kind of, every once in a while, you'll see them sort of zap one of the other crosses and turn them red. And then across the bottom, you can see, a chart evolving of how many people are infected and who's showing symptoms, etc. And this was in January and February, and then COVID hit. And so we pivoted towards less about education, because these events require a bunch of people to be together in close proximity, which isn't really an option. So we kind of put the hold on this sort of thing and started turning our mind towards tools that could be used for real. And one of the things that we wanted to see early on was like, given what was going on, can we actually see what's happening in the world? So this is an early prototyping. This is from mid-March. So, COVID hadn't really taken off in the United States at this point. But you can see, there's a timeline of how many cases there are worldwide. And you can look at how many active cases there are. You can look at how many people have died so far, and how many people recovered, which was a statistic that used to be reported more often. But do you want to look at the total cases, or do you want to look at the density? And at that point, Italy was the hot spot. And then you can click through to see kind of timelines, and do you want to align it by the current date, or when, how countries are responding once the disease hits their shores. And again, what's a simple, very easy and clear presentation for this data? There are other visualizations of the global pandemic, but they sometimes are hard to read, and it's sometimes hard to navigate and get it to the point of getting a clear story. So that was the goal with this piece. And then after a few months, we were interested in how's the contact tracing working. And so we visualized this data from South Korea, where South Korea has a really aggressive contact tracing program. And so, this is again back in May, but you can see in the map of South Korea, when they found a confirmed case, they would trace all the places they have been, and they were able to track, a lot of the flow of the disease, basically. And as you interact with this, you can see these different routes popping up. And in the columns on the left, one of the things that the contact tracers did is really identified those super spreader events. And what was the event that led to a bunch of people getting infected? And you can see essentially those causes. So there's this one call center that's responsible for a lot of cases. You can select that and see where people are traveling. There's also this church where the source of a lot of infections. And then you can look at not just the map, but also the individual people. And so in that top set of 3 rows, those are the people that were involved in the first generation of the outbreak. And then you've got in those other rows beneath it of, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees out of how it spread. And what's encouraging about this is seeing that those subsequent rows are getting smaller, right? Their contact tracing is working. They were able to identify the people who got sick and quarantine them, and the disease, this particular cluster of people, it only spread so far. So there's a lot of public health data that we were looking at as part of this effort, but Pardis Sabeti is also does a lot with sequencing. So this is taking a look at essentially the family tree of 4,000 samples of COVID-19 and where they are. And this is useful to figure out, if you're seeing an outbreak and you can identify the different strains, you can see, like, is the presence of COVID due to more people coming in and more strains entering our population, or is it a single strain has entered the population and has spread and is mutating? And so, this is some more of the work that we're doing with them. But the bulk of the work more recently has been building tools for institutions that are trying to get people safely back together. So we're working with the University in Colorado, where they want to, they're doing their attestation to basically say, hey, have you been exposed to COVID? And if you haven't, then you're safe to come on campus. And there are lots of people doing apps like this. For us, building the app, we want to make the experience as smooth as possible. So not only just doing the attestation though, but like, is there other data that you want to track that you can opt to share with the epidemiologists or not? You can keep it private, but you can essentially just really quickly say, hey, yeah, here are my symptoms with just a few simple taps in a really simple interface. And you can also track the contacts of, when, if you do get sick, who have you been in touch with, etc. And the app is fine. We want to make that super fluid. But part of the reason we're doing it is so that we can then make sure we're collecting the data that allows us to look at the kind of epidemiological data that can be used to help identify what's actually happening on campus. So, here we can look at, everyone who's not allowed to come on campus, why not? And, what symptoms are people reporting, et cetera. And just to be a full disclosure, like, this is all modeled data. I'm not showing anyone's personal data here. This is, we generate a bunch of fake data so that we can do this demo, because privacy with this sort of health information is a huge concern. But I just, want to be clear that we're not ratting anybody out or exposing any secrets here. So that is that's what we've been working on for the bulk of 2020. And I guess, do you think there's one last project I could talk to, or we could stop here? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess we can go over a little bit, so that's fine if you want to talk about it.
This one is just a quick passion project. I'm a huge fan of Miles Davis, the jazz trumpeter, or at least a fan of his music, and had been wanting to do something about his career because he had a long career, roughly 45 years. And what's particularly interesting is that he changed genres every 5 or 10 years, and every time he did that, he'd essentially break up the band and form a new one. And the thing is, he was always a prominent name. Like even from the get-go, he was playing amongst the biggest names of jazz. So he would attract, every time he reformed his bands, he'd get really, really good musicians who then go on to form, legendary bands of their own. So he's just, if you look at his career, it's just this, he's played with like all the giant names in jazz. And so that's, something I wanted to kind of explore. Couldn't find a good data set until I eventually stumbled across this fan site where they had every recording session that he'd ever been on and who played with him and when it was. So throwing together a quick sketch of that, we threw together a timeline of all his recording sessions, and that's what's going on across the bottom. And then doing a circle for each of the musicians, and bigger circles represent musicians who play with him more frequently. And so this was a quick sketch kind of telling us that there's something to this data. There's a story to be told. But in general, like the presentation is kind of droopy. Like the way that the lines kind of connect to the recording sessions is just kind of sad, kind of a rainy day sort of look to it. It's not really what we're after. I'm a developer, I'm not a designer. So I threw this together and I was happy that like no one else in the office was gonna let that fly. So I had to put it down for a while, but came back to it. And, this time I was really inspired by Blue Note and, a lot of the cover art for jazz albums in the 50s and 60s. And Ben took one look at this and said, that color's got to go. That is not going to work on screens like that. Sometimes it's going to show up as green, sometimes it's going to show up as yellow. It's just not something you can put on the web. Trying to have fun with the typography there and kind of the little timelines for the individual musicians was kind of echoing some of the shapes you might see in the graphic design of the era. But again, the musicians are circles, there's a timeline. And this time though, instead of connecting the musicians to the timeline, what you do is you mouse over a particular recording session and the musicians on that recording session would kind of line up and you list their names that way. But underneath the timeline, we've got all the cover art because we were able to integrate this data also with Apple Music and kind of identify like, hey, this recording session tied into this album, and here's this album in case you want to listen to it. But the cover art was kind of distracting in the long run. So actually, after putting this piece in the hands of some really good designers, this is where we ended up. So we still have the timeline, and we have the circles. Each of those likely circles represents one of the musicians. And as you mouse over the timeline, like this, now the circles go underneath the timeline, so it's a much cleaner separation between the field of all the musicians and the ones who appeared on this particular session. And this was a great way of looking at it for the web. But part of the challenge that we were interested in seeing was like, what if you could show the timelines for all the musicians all at once? And that wasn't really possible on the web, like these timelines, I can see Herbie Hancock, but he's only one person, I can't see everybody. So what if we did a poster? And so this is a first take at drawing, like putting on everyone's recording session timeline all together. Kind of, so from left to right, you still got everything oriented sequentially according to time, and then you've got the names of all the musicians. And now they're organized by what instruments they play, right? Bass, drums, percussion, strings, etc. Problem is that this poster would have been 6 feet tall and not really something we could sell very easily. So we tried putting it in an arc, and what if we put Miles Davis at the center because he's the most important person? That seemed like an obvious choice. And this is taking out everyone's names, and it's a cool shape. But it's sort of, and it was nice test, but it was kind of sad not to see the names of anybody except for Miles Davis. But this inspired the designer that was working on this, James. He sort of said, well, once it's in an arc and those ticks starts to look like vinyl, and he started combing through images and really finding some beautiful inspiration. And we ended up with this poster, and using gold ink on this French blue paper. And now the timeline for Miles is on the outside, because it's on the outside of the circle. There's a lot more room for the definition and all the detail of his timeline, and organized inside that are all the different other musicians. We added a layer of information where in addition to the gold ink, there's these light blue recording sessions. Those are ones that feed into a few of the specific albums that we've called out across his career that were sort of turning points. And so, like, any specific day is aligned from the outside towards the center, and you can see, you can trace that line that goes from, all that. Those are basically all these people that were on the one recording session, in this case for Burst of the Cool. And you can see different iterations of his band. That here we've got the four musicians who are in like his first grade quartet, and here's some other close-up shots of the poster that really show the texture really nicely, and it's in the right light. It's a really beautiful thing. We weren't able to show everyone's name on this because it just got too dense. So we made it a two-sided poster, and on the back we list everyone who ever appeared on one of those recording sessions, as well as how frequently they appeared. So that's just a little extra print thing. We love doing print, and this was a fun project. And that's it. So happy to take questions.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I'm happy to share it again. Yeah. Okay. Happy to share again if anyone has questions pertaining to any specific work that you want to look at. But I'd rather get a view of all of you. Yes, Allison.
Hi. Thanks for a great presentation. I was wondering, so the process that you mentioned with computer science, statistics, graphic design, and information visualization, is that like a team of multiple people, or is it more that like it's best to be proficient in all of these areas if you're like considering a career in the field? Yeah,
that's a great question. So Ben, who founded the firm, is intimidatingly smart with all of those fields, and he's intimidatingly smart, but he's not an intimidating person. He's actually really nice and fun to work with. But in general, I guess the people in the office, there are definitely people who are stronger in development and people who are stronger in design, and we all have an interest. I think the big thing for our firm is everyone's very curious. And really interested in the bulk of the work, and so it's very a team atmosphere. For us, what that means in terms of the process is that those interests have to be represented at every step of the way, because we like to iterate and go back. We don't like to just let the engineers have a turn and they're done with the coding part, and then let the designers have a turn and they make it pretty, right? It's much more conversation right from the get-go of hey, here's the data, here's what I was able to find in it, and the designer saying, can we do this? Can we do that? What if we represent it this way? And kind of it's definitely a conversation and back and forth. And we always try to make sure that all those concerns that are embodied in those different fields are present in the project. And for us, most of the time, that's multiple people. You get a few special people who are gifted in all of them, but for day-to-day practice, you don't have to be an expert in everything, but you have to be open to it, right? You can't just say, I'm not gonna worry about your font sizes because that's not really cool engineering. No, the typography is an incredibly powerful part of the final piece. So even if the designers don't know how to implement certain font features on the web, then as one of the developers, I help make sure that happens.
I just have one quick part to that. So for instance, with the Stanford project, it looked like a lot of science, and I did my undergrad in gender studies, so I don't like know a lot about science, but in general, with those projects, is it more like you're learning about the material as they come up, or do you have like consultants who might be like an expert in like biology or something like that?
That's a hugely insightful question. Yeah, so I'm not an expert in biology either, right? What we try to do, our best client relationships, and we've been pretty lucky with most of our client relationships, is, they come to us and they trust us with the coding and the design of everything, but we rely on them heavily to be the domain experts in what they're doing. And so we try to talk with them at least once a week, if not more often, to say, hey, is this sort of, we might draft something up and put it in front of them and say, is this kind of what you're up to? And we try to get a general understanding of what they're doing. Like I started to read some of the biology textbooks, but I'll be honest, I couldn't get very far. There's other stuff to do. But we would, get a general feel for what they're after and then put it in front of them, and then they would critique it and say, yeah, what we're really after is something like this. And that, a lot of the time, those conversations, you have to kind of extrapolate as well. Like they might come to you and say, yeah, okay, so I was looking at this and this is really great, but what I want is a button right here that does this. And you're like, okay, a button? And you kind of say, well, what does this button do? And as you unpack what the functionality that you're after, you realize, oh, wait a minute, actually what we want to do is totally break apart the app and put it together in this totally different way to have this functionality kind of come to the surface organically instead of having this weird little random button off to the side. And so those can be really disruptive conversations because they can mess up weeks of what you thought was a good design. But it's almost always the way to go. So that communication is key, making sure you've got a good relationship with your clients where you trust one another to kind of solve those problems together.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those were good answers.
I got a couple questions unless someone else wants to jump in.
Yeah.
So to kind of piggyback off of that, it sounds like you do more of a collaborative effort when it comes to the projects that come to you from clients. So are they doing most of the analysis and kind of working with you on the visualization side and the programming side, or do you do a lot of the analysis yourself and kind of come to them with concepts or ideas based off of that analysis?
That's a good question. Actually, it changes from client to client, right? Some clients will come to us and just drop this huge wad of data in our hands and say, like, I don't know what's going on here. Can you make sense of this? And can you make something of this? And can you do something cool with it? And sometimes you've got experts who are, like for instance, the Stanford people, like are deep experts in their data. But as soon as we're able to put it in a visual representation that they can interact with, they're just like, wow, so they have the strength of the analysis behind it. But sometimes you do have clients where we're working on a project right now with the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, and they are really trying to promote the cause for adult literacy in the United States, and it's a very worthwhile effort. And they're really great with the literacy stuff. They're not always as strong. Not everyone on their team is as strong with the statistics, and so they will give us they'll ask us to research the data that they might be able to use to make their case, and we'll present it to them, and we'll come up with first draft of findings, and we'll run that over to them, and they'll say yes, or they may say, that doesn't quite jive with what my understanding is, and that causes us to take another peek at the data in that new frame of mind, and kind of see if we come to a different conclusion. So it can be a whole range. It's I think there was definitely, we've been around for like 10 years, and in the early, around 2012 to 15, like there's this data visualization hype. And so there were the types of questions we get from clients were very much like, hey, I've got this data set and I think it's going to be cool and it's going to do great things for us and do something with it. and sometimes we could, and sometimes we couldn't. You know, so it's what we would find in there might be different. I think now more of our clients have people who are a little bit more savvy on the data science side of things, so we don't have to do as much of that initial investigation as we used to.
Cool. Also, it sounds like that you have to do a lot of research yourself when it comes to finding data and data sets. What's the process behind that? Is just like a lot of really clever Googling, or is there anything beyond that? Because these guys are going to be doing a lot of research for their midterm and finding data online as a source. So if you guys have any tips when it comes to that.
That's a tough one. We used to have some journalists in the office, and they were fantastic. They would uncover all sorts of great stuff. So, you know, go where the reporters go, like that. I don't know if that's helpful, probably not. But you know, there are lots of, depending on the data that you're looking for, right? OPEC, United Nations, there are lots of international efforts on data like that. If you're interested in data on women and girls, we actually did this one effort that I didn't talk about today called No Ceilings, where for the first time we tried to gather 20 years worth of data on the status of women and girls in one place. And so if you go to noceilings.org, it's a kind of a portal to all that data, if that's the topic you're after. But there's no single, I'm not good with finding, you know, the one place where you can get all the data. There have been a few efforts to gather data repositories in one central location, and some of them, you know, with mixed success. One other thing, though, I think one thing I have found surprising is if you go to the census, or, you know, other organizations where it's just like a big data set, there's usually, you know, they're known for this core data set, but there's often, you know, all sorts of prongs and different directions of data that might be there as well. So I wouldn't avoid those major clearinghouses, because sometimes they'll have some variation of the data that you wouldn't have suspected that they would have. That can be really interesting.
Cool. Some good tips.
Hopefully.
Anyone else have? Yeah, it definitely it's time consuming to find some good data for any project.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions? I don't want to use up all our time. I guess one question that would probably be beneficial for these guys is understanding your personal path to how you got to Fathom, and if there's any sort of like, if any one of these guys are interested in information design or data visualization as a career, do you have suggestions on what to focus on?
Gosh. So the personal path was roundabout. I only started programming like when I was 30, and found I liked it and got into databases and got into data visualization because it was a great tool for visualizing large data sets, and gradually made my way over to Fathom. But I was originally doing like database administration, you know, sort of related tangentially, but like I was programming for 10 years before I started at Fathom. So, you know, patience pays off. That's one thing I can say. And, you know, gosh, and if you're interested in getting into information design and visualization right away, you know, there are definitely libraries and tools out there that are good for helping do the first pass of data visualization. The thing that and those can be great, you know, and there's lots of applications for that. Like there's so many needs for people to understand their data that being fluent with any tools for how to quickly put together some representation of the data is likely going to be useful. The sort of work we do, we frequently, we find that sometimes the libraries and the pre-built things kind of lead you into a direction that looks, you know, like it came out of that library, which is a fine thing, but it's not what we're usually going for. We're trying to come up with something that's incredibly specific to whichever data set we're working with. And so having an awareness of those graphic design principles, even if you're not going to be a graphic designer, you know, specifically, is really useful in evaluating how effective a data visualization is going to be. So I think in general, I don't have, like, obviously there's no silver bullet to how to get a job in this stuff. But being aware of the different aspects, from the computer science through the graphic design is going to be helpful. And then, find the part of it that you love and really just hammer away at that.
Cool. I'm curious. I know Ben is one of the co-creators of processing. I actually teach a creative coding class and use processing in P5 in that class.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you use processing as a tool, or there's something else that you use for programming some of these like test visualizations that you showed us.
Yeah. So for the What the World Eats, the tool that one was definitely built in processing. Yeah, when you've got that much processing expertise in the house, you kind of want to use processing. We use it a lot. It's Java. Yeah, it's funny when processing kicked off, which was like in the early 2000s. Like Java was the language that you could run it on your desktop. You could do print stuff. You could run it on the web. And as time has gone by, it's been relegated to much more of a server-side language. So it's sort of like, it's getting harder to do processing-like activities with Java, but we still do use it a lot because there's just so much experience with it. And you can generate lots of print things. A typical workflow for us will be that we'll, like with the Miles poster, we'll use processing to do the generative layout and kind of export that to a PDF or an SVG, and then import that into Illustrator, and that's where we'll apply the finishing touches and kind of tweak the typography to be really nice and etc. But yeah, processing is great for print. We can run it on desktop. We'll do installations using processing as well. But basically, for the past few years, most of our clients have wanted the reach of the web. So we've been doing a lot more with web servers and HTML5 and JavaScript.
Do you use D3 or is it just pure JavaScript?
So D3, like when D3 first came out, we were pretty much already, well, we weren't already rolling, but it was still a younger library at that point. And it wasn't doing, like, we would be doing things with 10,000, objects on the page at once, and D3 was too slow for that. I think they've re-engineered D3 so that it can handle that sort of load pretty elegantly, but never enough for us to make the jump over to, we kind of developed our own way of doing things, our own set of libraries that we use internally. And so sometimes we use D3, but for the most part, it's quicker to build off things we've already built ourselves.
Cool. Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have a question. For the hieroglyphic Frankenstein book, I would assume that there was some sort of automation process for making that book, and like which coding languages did you use for that?
That was a processing project. That was really, Ben has most of the expertise on that. Yeah, the thing about actually Ben in processing is that he's got access to all the things that are not documented. So because he wrote them. And so there's all sorts of things where he could execute, basically, parse the text of Frankenstein, the book, and identify the unique words, and then issue the query. He could write a program that would then make the Google request for those PDFs to fetch them, and then extract the fonts and everything like that, and then wrote basically just this huge statistical probability thing as to, okay, at this phase of the book, what's the probability I'm going to use one of the rare fonts versus what I'm going to versus one of the more common fonts, and just bit by bit, character by character, iterated through the book and generated it. So I think that generated it as just one long flow of text, and then probably used InDesign to put it in a book format. I'm a little bit rougher when it gets to that phase, but there was a lot of programming going on, but it was all basically within processing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a whole hidden world to processing that I'm not aware of that's not documented?
Yeah, kind of. It's like I think he's gotten better about documenting it, definitely. But there are hidden features, and it's also wonderful because it's an open source project. So there are times when we'll do monkey patches, which is, for those of you who are not like super into coding, on an open source project, they're usually they try to open up ways for you to do what you want to do, but sometimes because it's open source, you can just go in and like essentially break the code in the way that you want it to be broken, and do this really ugly hack, and you can't use it for anything else anymore, but it does exactly what you want it to do. So we've got an insider view as to, hey, let's do that because that is the fastest way to get things done. And just make sure you never commit it and try to submit it back to the processing foundation and have everyone else's code across the world break.
Very, very interesting. Eye-opening. Had no idea. Cool.
Right, be telling this,
yeah. Anyone else have any other thoughts or questions or comments before we let Mark go? All right. So can we please unmute and give Mark a round of applause? Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was very insightful and inspiring. So thank you so much for that.
Right. Well, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Bye, Mark.
Bye.
Bye.